Story 1. The Night Visitor. Ever since the accident left me paralyzed, strange things started happening at night. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but now I know it's real, and it's watching me. It's been 6 months since the car crash. 6 months since I woke up in the hospital to the unbearable weight of a doctor's voice saying, "You'll never walk again." 6 months of staring at the ceiling in my tiny apartment, confined to this bed like it's a prison cell. My life has shrunk to 4 walls, a wheelchair I can barely use, and a constant ache in my legs, a cruel trick of my body, since I can't even feel them. I thought the worst thing about being paralyzed would be the helplessness. I was wrong. The first night it happened, I didn't think much of it. I heard a creak in the hallway, faint and distant, like a floorboard settling. My apartment is old, so it wasn't unusual. I was half asleep, my mind foggy with exhaustion, and I brushed it off as nothing. But then I heard it again, louder this time. A deliberate step. I stared at the door, my heart thudding in my chest. The door was closed, and I had locked it earlier, or at least I thought I had. My eyes scanned the shadows pooling in the corners of the room. Nothing moved. No sound followed. Eventually, I convinced myself I was imagining things. The next night, the footsteps were closer. They started in the hallway, just like before, but this time, I heard them pause outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound of my pulse pounded in my ears. And then, softly, so softly I almost didn't hear it, I heard the doorknob jiggle. I wanted to scream, but who would hear me? My neighbors on either side are young, loud college kids. I doubt they'd care, even if I did manage to yell loud enough. My phone was on the nightstand, but it might as well have been a mile away. I couldn't reach it. I stared at the door until dawn, the room suffocatingly silent. The third night was when things really started to unravel. I was lying in bed, staring at my computer screen across the room. I'd left it on out of habit, a comforting glow in the darkness. The footsteps came again, but this time, I didn't hear them in the hallway. They started inside the bedroom. My skin prickled as the steps crept closer, slow and deliberate. I couldn't see anything in the dim light, but I could feel something watching me. My breath came in shallow gasps, and the muscles in my neck ached from how tightly I'd pressed myself against the headboard. Then, something brushed against the bed frame. It wasn't a knock or a scrape. It was a soft, deliberate touch. A soundless, wordless gesture, like whatever it was wanted me to know it was there. Tears stung my eyes as I fought the primal urge to move, to get away, even though I knew I couldn't. The next thing I remember is the click of the door. It closed. No slam, no creak, just a soft, controlled click as if it had been pushed shut with care. I didn't sleep at all that night. By the 4th night, I was losing it. The air in the apartment felt heavier, like it was pressing down on me, crushing my lungs with every breath. I told myself it was just paranoia, that I was psyching myself out. But I knew better. I'd started noticing small things during the day too. A glass on the counter wasn't where I'd left it. My wheelchair had shifted slightly from where I parked it. My pills, which I keep neatly lined up, had been moved out of order. I left my phone on the bed that night, gripping it tightly in my hand. If anything happened, I'd call someone, anyone. I couldn't take the waiting, the not knowing. At around 2 a.m., my computer monitor flickered. I froze. The screen had been blank all evening, on sleep mode. Now it was on, glowing faintly in the dark. My stomach twisted as I realized it wasn't just displaying my desktop. It was a live feed. Of me. The camera angle wasn't from my laptop webcam. It was above me, looking straight down at my bed. I tilted my head back as far as I could, staring up at the ceiling, but there was nothing there. Just blank plaster. My hand tightened around my phone. The feed flickered again, distorting with static. When it came back, I wasn't alone on the screen. A shape moved at the edge of the frame, barely visible, a dark, spindly silhouette that seemed to ripple like smoke. My body was shaking, a cold sweat drenching my skin. It was on the ceiling, crawling toward me like some grotesque spider. I wanted to scream, but my throat was locked tight. I pressed my phone's power button, desperate to call for help, but the screen stayed black. It wouldn't turn on. The thing stopped moving. It hovered directly above me on the live feed, its limbs impossibly long, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. Slowly, it turned toward the camera, as if it knew I was watching. And then I saw its face. It was my own, not the face I see in the mirror every morning, but something hollowed out and twisted. My skin was pale and stretched tight over my bones, my eyes black pits that stared straight into me. Its mouth opened, and although no sound came from the screen, I heard its voice in my head. "You're already dead." The monitor went dark. I felt a weight on my chest, heavy and cold, pinning me to the bed. My vision blurred, and my limbs felt like they were sinking into the mattress. The last thing I remember before everything went black was the sound of my own voice, whispering in my ear. And then nothing. When I woke up, it was morning. Sunlight streamed through the blinds, painting the room in pale gold. For a brief, blissful moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare, until I saw the computer monitor. The feed was back, but it wasn't live. It showed me lying in bed, pale and lifeless, my body motionless. The timestamp in the corner said 3:42 a.m., the exact time I'd blacked out. And then I realized something. I wasn't looking at the screen from my bed. I was looking at it from above. Story 2. The mirror game. My physical therapist told me to use a mirror to trick my brain into feeling my legs again. But what I saw in the reflection made me wish I never tried. When the accident happened, I thought the worst part would be the pain. The crunch of metal, the jolt as my body snapped forward, the sound of my own scream reverberating in my ears. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came after, waking up in a hospital bed and realizing I couldn't move my legs. At first, I refused to accept it. The doctor said it wasn't permanent, that I could regain some mobility with therapy. That's what I held on to, the tiny thread of hope that kept me from going insane. Every day, I pushed myself through the exercises, the stretches, the routines, even though I couldn't feel anything below my waist. That's when they introduced me to the mirror box. It's called mirror therapy, my therapist explained. You place the mirror between your legs like this so it reflects your healthy leg. When you move your good leg, the reflection tricks your brain into thinking your paralyzed leg is moving too. It's about retraining your brain to reconnect with your body. I was skeptical. It sounded like pseudoscience, like something I'd see on a late-night infomercial. But I was desperate. I needed to believe there was a way back to normal, so I agreed to try it. At first, it was strange. I sat in my wheelchair, propped the mirror between my legs, and stared at the reflection. When I moved my right leg, the mirror made it look like my left leg, the paralyzed one, was moving. It felt weird, seeing my other leg bend and flex, even though I knew it wasn't real. But then something happened. I felt it, a faint, almost imperceptible sensation, like a tingle deep inside my left leg. It was fleeting, barely there, but it was enough to make my breath catch in my throat. "Good," the therapist said, smiling. "That's exactly what we want." For the first time since the accident, I felt hope. Over the next few days, I kept at it. The tingling sensations became stronger, more vivid. I started to believe the therapy was working, that my body was finally waking up. But then things changed. It started with small things, little moments that didn't make sense. I'd move my right leg, and for a split second, the reflection didn't quite match. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. The mirrored leg moved faster than my real one, or it twitched slightly when I was perfectly still. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light or a flaw in the mirror itself. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. One night, I was practicing alone in my apartment. I moved my right leg, watching the reflection bend and flex like usual. Then I stopped. My real leg was still, but the mirrored leg wasn't. It twitched. I blinked, leaning closer to the mirror. For a moment, nothing happened. The reflection was perfectly normal. I let out a shaky laugh, feeling ridiculous for being so paranoid. But as I reached for the mirror to put it away, the reflection smiled. Not a normal smile. It was too wide, too sharp, like someone had carved it into my face with a knife. My stomach turned, and I shoved the mirror onto the floor. The glass didn't break, but the sound echoed through the room, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I covered the mirror with a blanket and shoved it into the closet. I told myself I was done with it, that I didn't need it anymore. But the sound started that night. At first, it was a faint tapping like fingernails against glass. I lay in bed, staring at the closet, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, like it was trying to get my attention. "Stop it," I whispered, my voice trembling. "You're just imagining it." The tapping stopped. For a moment, the silence was almost worse. I lay there, frozen, straining to hear any sound. Then, just as I started to relax, I heard a voice. It was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it was unmistakable. "Let me out." My blood turned to ice. The voice was coming from the closet. "Let me out," it said again, louder this time. I pulled the blankets over my head like a terrified child. I stayed that way until morning, too afraid to move, too afraid to breathe. When the sun came up, I convinced myself it had been a dream. Sleep deprivation and stress, that's all it was. But deep down, I knew better. I avoided the closet for days. Every time I passed it, I felt like something was watching me, waiting. The tapping came back every night, more persistent, more desperate. On the fifth night, I couldn't take it anymore. I ripped the blanket off the mirror and stared into the glass, my heart racing. For a moment, everything seemed normal. The reflection showed me, pale and exhausted, slumped in my wheelchair. Then it moved. My reflection stood up. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My real body was still sitting in the wheelchair, but the reflection was standing fully upright, staring down at me with that same twisted smile. It leaned closer to the glass, its eyes dark and hollow, its grin impossibly wide. "Switch," it mouthed. Before I could scream, it raised a hand. There was something in it, a knife. The reflection slammed the blade into the glass, and the world shattered around me. I woke up gasping, my body drenched in sweat. Sunlight streamed through the window, bathing the room in soft light. My legs, they moved. I could feel them. I laughed, tears streaming down my face. It had worked. The therapy had worked. But something was wrong. I turned to look at the mirror, and my blood ran cold. My reflection was still there, still sitting in the wheelchair. It was banging on the glass, its face twisted in terror. Its mouth moved silently, but I knew what it was saying. "Let me out." Story 3. The Silent Witness. The worst part about being paralyzed isn't the immobility. It's being stuck, watching things you can't explain, and knowing no one will believe you. I wasn't always like this. Before the accident, I was an avid mountain biker, tearing through trails, breathing in the wild air. It was my escape from everything, the noise, the stress, the constant pressure to be on all the time. But then one day, a sharp turn and a loose patch of dirt turned my escape into a nightmare. I hit the ground hard, heard the sickening crack of my spine, and felt my world go dark. Now I live alone in a small cabin in the woods, the kind of place I once thought would be peaceful. I had moved out here to rehab in solitude, thinking the quiet might help me focus on recovery. Instead, it became a prison. No one comes out here unless I call, and even then it's rare. My friends have their own lives, my family lives hours away, and I've learned to stop hoping for check-ins. At first, the solitude was manageable. Then the strange things began. The first time I noticed it, I thought I was just imagining things. I had set my coffee mug down on the kitchen counter before wheeling myself back to the living room. Later, when I went to retrieve it, it was on the other side of the counter. I frowned, trying to remember if I'd moved it, and simply forgotten. I hadn't been sleeping well, so I brushed it off. The next day, my wheelchair brakes wouldn't work. I'd left the chair by my bed that morning, locked in a place, but when I reached for it, it rolled away from me, as though someone had nudged it. I laughed nervously, convincing myself it was just an accident. Maybe I hadn't engaged the brakes properly. Then came the breath. It was late at night, maybe 3 or 4 in the morning. I was in bed, staring at the ceiling, struggling to fall asleep like always. That's when I felt it, a cold, soft exhalation brushing against my cheek. My skin prickled. It was faint, but unmistakable. Someone or something was breathing on me. I froze, too terrified to move. I listened, straining my ears for any sound. But the room was silent except for my own panicked breaths. When I finally found the courage to turn my head, the room was empty. For days after, I told myself it was just stress, an overactive imagination fueled by too many horror movies and too much isolation. But the occurrences kept piling up. Some nights, I'd wake to the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. Slow, deliberate, and horribly real. I couldn't see anything in the dark, but the noise echoed through the cabin, setting my teeth on edge. Other times, I'd wake to find items in my house had moved. My keys would be in the sink instead of the table. My blanket would be on the floor, despite my inability to kick it off. Once, my medication bottle, which I always kept on the nightstand, was found under the couch. Then came the footprints. It had been raining all day, and the ground outside was slick with mud. That night, I woke up to a strange feeling. An itch in my brain, the instinct that something was watching me. I reached for the flashlight I kept on my nightstand and scanned the room. My heart stopped. There were muddy footprints leading from the door to the side of my bed. The prints were large, barefoot, and smeared in odd directions, like whoever made them had shuffled rather than walked. They stopped right beside me, and yet the floor around my bed was dry. I hadn't heard the door open, hadn't heard anyone come in. The fear was paralyzing. Literally, I couldn't scream, couldn't run, couldn't do anything but lie there, trembling, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The next morning I called my brother. He promised to come out and stay with me for a few days, but something came up at work, and he canceled at the last minute. I didn't blame him. He had his own life, and I didn't want to sound ungrateful. But as the sun set that night, I felt a familiar dread creep over me. I decided to set up a camera. If something was coming into my room, I wanted proof. I placed the camera on my dresser, angled toward the bed. I left the light on for good measure, telling myself it was for visibility, but really, I was just too afraid of the dark. Then I waited. Nothing happened for hours. I drifted in and out of an uneasy sleep, my nerves wound too tight to fully relax. Around 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of footsteps. Not the heavy, dragging sound I'd heard before. These were deliberate, almost human. I lay perfectly still, my heart hammering in my chest, staring at the camera's blinking light. The footsteps stopped at the edge of my bed. I didn't dare move. My eyes darted to the corner of the room where the camera stood. If something was there, the camera would see it. The next morning, I replayed the footage. At first, everything seemed normal. I saw myself lying in bed, motionless, the blanket rising and falling with each shallow breath. Then the screen flickered just for a second. When it stabilized, I wasn't alone. A shadowy figure stood at the foot of my bed, tall and thin, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. The thing didn't move, didn't breathe, it just watched. And then, slowly, it turned its head toward the camera. I screamed, slamming the laptop shut. My pulse thundered in my ears, and my hands shook as I struggled to catch my breath. I didn't want to open the laptop again, didn't want to see whatever that thing was. That night, I didn't set up the camera. I couldn't. When I woke up, it wasn't to the sound of footsteps or dragging. It was to the sound of laughter. My own laughter. It took me a moment to realize it wasn't coming from my mouth. I turned my head toward the mirror across the room, and my heart dropped. My reflection was sitting upright in bed, grinning at me. It shouldn't have been possible. I couldn't sit up on my own, couldn't even push myself up without help. But there I was, staring back at myself, my teeth bared in a grotesque, mocking smile. The reflection raised a hand and waved. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I couldn't move, couldn't do anything but watch as the reflection climbed out of bed, standing fully upright, and walked toward the door. That's when I realized I wasn't the one in the bed anymore. I was the thing in the mirror, trapped, helpless, and invisible. I watched as my body, its body, reached for the doorknob, still grinning. And then it walked away. Story 4. Voices on the monitor. After my accident, my sister installed a baby monitor to check on me. Now, I wish she hadn't, because the voices coming through aren't hers. The accident was brutal, a freak pile-up on the highway. 1 minute I was driving home from work, and the next, my car was crushed like an empty soda can. When I woke up in the hospital, they told me I'd never walk again. My sister, Emma, was the one who took me in. I didn't want to burden her, but I didn't have many options. To make things easier, she set up a baby monitor in my room. She told me it was for emergencies, so she could hear me if I needed help while she was downstairs. It was comforting at first, knowing someone was always listening. At least, I thought it was her listening. The first few nights, everything seemed fine. Emma would check on me occasionally through the monitor, her voice calm and reassuring. "Do you need water?" she'd ask. "Or are you comfortable?" I'd answer, and she'd tell me to try and get some rest. But then the static started. It was faint at first, just a low hum that I barely noticed. I figured it was interference. Emma kept the receiver in the kitchen next to the microwave, and I thought maybe the electronics were clashing. But the static got worse. On the third night, I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when the monitor crackled to life. "Why are you still here?" The voice wasn't Emma's. It was soft, almost a whisper, but there was something off about it. Something cold. My stomach tightened as I stared at the speaker on my nightstand. "Emma," I called out, my voice shaking. No response. Just static. I told myself I'd imagined it. Maybe I was half asleep, dreaming. But the next night it happened again. This time, I was wide awake. The monitor buzzed, and then came the voice. "Do you feel it crawling under your skin?" I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The voice was louder now, more distinct. It didn't sound human. There was a strange cadence to it, like whoever, or whatever, was speaking wasn't used to forming words. "Emma," I said again, louder this time. Nothing. I grabbed my phone and called her. A moment later, I heard her footsteps rushing up the stairs. She burst into the room, looking concerned. "What's wrong?" she asked. I pointed at the monitor. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" "The voice," I said. "It wasn't you. Someone else was on the monitor." Emma frowned, picking up the receiver. She held it to her ear and shook her head. "It's just static," she said. I stared at her, my heart pounding. It spoke to me. I insisted. It asked why I was still here. It said something about something crawling under my skin. Emma's face softened, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. "You've been under a lot of stress," she said gently. "Maybe you're just hearing things." I wanted to argue, but the words caught in my throat. Maybe she was right. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Except it wasn't. The voices came back the next night, and the night after that. They grew louder, more insistent. They didn't just whisper anymore. They called me by name. "Jason," they said. "Do you remember the accident? Do you remember what it felt like?" My chest tightened. How could they know? I hadn't even told Emma the full details. The crunch of metal, the weight of the dashboard pinning me down, the agonizing seconds when I was sure I was going to die. I started to dread the nights. Every time the sun went down, I felt like I was being watched. The air in my room felt heavier, colder, like something invisible was pressing down on me. One night, I decided to unplug the monitor. I thought if I cut the connection, the voices would stop. But when I reached for the cord, the monitor crackled, louder than ever. "Don't," the voice hissed. "We're not finished yet." I yanked my hand back, my pulse racing. The static faded, and for a moment, the room was silent. Then the voice came again, soft and deliberate. "Look behind you." I froze. My body felt like it was sinking into the mattress. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The room was dead silent, but I swore I felt someone standing behind me. The air was cold against my neck, and then I felt it, a hot, rancid breath, slow and deliberate. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My body wouldn't obey me. My hands clutched at the blanket, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might stop. The monitor crackled one last time. "We're taking turns," the voice said, and then it went silent. When I woke the next morning, sunlight was streaming through the window. For a moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare. But then I noticed something. I could move. My legs, my arms, my whole body. It responded when I told it to. I sat up, almost laughing with relief. The nightmare was over. I could walk again. But then I saw the mirror across the room. Someone was lying in the bed behind me. It was me. My reflection was still paralyzed, still trapped, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. Its mouth moved silently, forming words I couldn't hear. And then the monitor crackled, "Your turn," the voice said. Story 5. The Night Nurse. My family hired a night nurse to care for me. I never saw her face, but I wish I never met her at all. The accident took everything from me. One moment, I was on my motorcycle flying down the highway, and the next, I was staring at the sterile white tiles of a hospital room, unable to move anything below my neck. The doctor said it was a miracle I survived. I didn't feel so lucky. After weeks in the hospital, I was sent home, and my family insisted I needed help at night. They didn't want to leave me alone, vulnerable, while they slept. So, they hired a night nurse. She arrived the first evening after I was discharged. I heard her soft footsteps before I saw her, and when she finally entered my room, I couldn't help but feel a little unsettled. She wore scrubs like any other nurse, but her face was completely obscured by a white surgical mask. Only her eyes were visible, dark and unreadable. "Hello," I said, my voice weak and raspy. She didn't respond. She nodded slightly and began setting up her things. A bag, a clipboard, and some medical tools I couldn't identify. At first, I thought she was just quiet, maybe shy. She was gentle, careful as she adjusted my pillows and checked the floor that delivered my medication. But she never spoke, not even when I tried to make conversation. I asked my mom about her the next morning. "She seems strange," I said hesitantly. Mom frowned. "She's quiet, but she's a professional. We're lucky to have her." I nodded, trying to convince myself that my unease was just paranoia. But things started to change. The first night I woke up with an odd sensation. My chest felt cold, like ice had been pressed against my skin. My breathing was shallow, and I couldn't move my head to look down, but I could feel it, a damp chill spreading across my ribs. When the nurse came in for her usual checks, I tried to ask her about it. "I feel cold," I managed to whisper. She didn't answer. Instead, she leaned over me, her masked face inches from mine. For a moment, I thought I heard her whisper something so faint I could barely catch it. "Almost done." "What?" I croaked, but she was already moving away, checking my floor with her gloved hands. The next morning, I noticed bruises on my arms. They were faint but unmistakable, dark purple splotches that looked like fingerprints. "Do you think the nurse might be rough with me at night?" I asked my mom over breakfast. Mom's face darkened. "What do you mean?" I showed her the bruises. Her frown deepened, but she shook her head. "I don't think so. She's a professional. You're probably just bruising easily because of your medication." I wasn't so sure. Over the next week, the bruises got worse. Not just on my arms, but on my legs, my chest, even my neck. The cold sensations came back too, stronger this time. I'd wake up feeling like I'd been submerged in freezing water, my skin clammy and tight. And then there were the whispers. I'd hear them at night, faint and garbled, like a radio tuned to the wrong frequency. They seemed to come from the corner of the room, where the nurse always sat. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone chilled me. Low, almost sing-song, like she was murmuring a lullaby to herself. One night, I forced myself to ask her directly, "Are you talking to me?" I whispered. She didn't answer. She didn't even look up. The final straw came when I asked my dad about the nurse. "What nurse?" he asked, staring at me like I'd lost my mind. "The night nurse," I said. "The one you and Mom hired to take care of me." Dad's face went pale. "Jason," he said slowly, "we didn't hire anyone." I felt a chill crawl down my spine. "What do you mean?" "Your mom and I talked about it," he said. "But you said you didn't want strangers in the house. We've been letting you rest at night." But my mouth went dry. I've been seeing her every night. Dad exchanged a look with my mom. She looked just as confused, her brow furrowed. "Honey," she said gently, "we haven't brought anyone in. Are you sure you're not dreaming?" I shook my head, panic rising in my chest. I knew what I'd seen. I knew she was real. That night, I set up a camera in the corner of the room. If no one believed me, I'd get proof. I barely slept, my heart racing as I waited for the nurse to arrive. Sure enough, around midnight, I heard the soft creak of the door. The sound of her footsteps made my skin crawl. The next morning, I woke up drenched in sweat. My entire body ached, and the cold sensation was worse than ever. My mom came in to check on me, but I waved her off, eager to review the footage. What I saw made my stomach churn. The camera showed the nurse entering the room, her movements slow and deliberate. She leaned over my bed, her face close to mine. Then she reached in her bag and pulled out something sharp, something that glinted in the dim light. A scalpel. My breath hitched as I watched her cut into my skin, her hands impossibly steady. Blood pooled on the sheets as she worked, but her movements were precise, almost surgical. And then she turned to the camera. She reached up, her gloved fingers gripping the edge of her mask. Slowly, she pulled it off. It was my face underneath. Not my current face, pale and gaunt from weeks of being bedridden, but a healthier, fuller version, like the face I had before the accident. She smiled, her lips curling into a cruel grin. The screen went black. A knock at the door made me jump. "Time for your next session," a voice whispered. I turned my head toward the door, my body trembling. The nurse stood there, scalpel in hand, her stolen face twisted into a mask of delight. And then she stepped inside. Thanks for watching. If you like the story, click like, subscribe to the channel, and write an idea for the next story in the comments.